Marines' involvement began in Vietnam in 1962 when elements of the 3rd Marine Division arrived on the scene to assist the South Vietnamese in their efforts to curb communist insurgency below the 17th parallel. No matter what you have been led to believe, that, after all, was the original mission of U.S. forces in South Vietnam. The views developed by most Americans not directly involved in Vietnam have their roots in the U.S. media. Unlike the award-winning World War II correspondents like Ernie Pyle, many of the major TV and print correspondents commuted to the war zone. Leaving the relative luxury and safety of hotel rooms by helicopter to cover the results of firefights and artillery battles, returning to happy hour at an air-conditioned tavern hours later. This video is dedicated to those the media types came to visit. This video is dedicated to all the American warriors of the Vietnam War. It is dedicated to those who chose the honorable course and served their country and helped defend the cause of democracy on foreign soil. Hear now from 14 Marine officers, members of the Distinguished Class 667 of the Basic School at Quantico, Virginia, who volunteered, who trained, who went, and who served in the noblest traditions of the United States Marine Corps. These combat veterans may help you with a better perspective about America's involvement in Vietnam.
It is hard to look at the wall and to think that these guys are gone forever.
It's the best form of government, and I hope you support it.
I never saw anybody run in combat.
These young Marines they'd do anything you ask. They'd die for you.
It goes without saying that war is not a nice place. Men participate in combat for the greater good, something bigger than themselves. Warriors throughout time tell us that the fear, the confusion, the emotion, and the carnage of battle are elements that only can be experienced personally. The written word, film, and even videotape cannot capture the essence of battle. Herein lies the main source of enmity between Vietnam veterans and the media. The talking heads, half a globe away, produced images in pictures and with words that had very little to do with what was occurring and everything to do with generating entertainment. All of the men interviewed here were in Vietnam in 1968. Most historians agree that this was the turning point in the outcome of the war.
In my view, the Vietnam War was lost in the hearts of America as a result of the American media's portrayal of what was taking place in Vietnam. Whether it was the reporting of what went on at the Battle of Khe Sanh, the siege at Khe Sanh, which they reported as being a loss for us, that we were being just hamburger meat for the NVA. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Yes, we lost casualties to artillery and rocket fire. I believe the number was 199, something like that, Marines killed at Khe Sanh, and some 1,500 wounded, shrapnel wounds and so forth. But during that same 77-day siege, the North Vietnamese reported years afterward that they lost in excess of 15,000 to 20,000 troops. Now, by anyone's standard, that's a loss. They never took over the base at Khe Sanh. They never mounted any real formidable assault to try to take over the base at Khe Sanh. Yet, in the media portrayals back in the country, back in America during the time, or what people were seeing on their TVs was that we were losing, and that they had control of the area, over that area of the country, which was totally false.
It had nothing to do with the United States Armed Forces. It had everything to do with the public opinion in the United States, influencing the McNamara's and the spin doctors and that, which was a great insult to our families and to us. As far as portrayal in the more responsible media, the print and the nightly news, they certainly dwelled far too much on, oh my God, tragedy. It's like every, wrecks or any disaster, they're the first ones, they want to have a reporter standing in front of a burning house. And it was just sensationalized beyond belief, and very skewed.
I was with the 39th Arvin Ranger Battalion in December 1968, which was during a ceasefire. And during the ceasefire, we were out in the field, and there was not a ceasefire, and we had the only action, at least in the Da Nang area, that was going on. And news media were flown out in helicopters to cover this engagement with North Vietnamese troops. And I remember vividly one of the news photographers that came out there that arrived when all the action was over, and was very disappointed that he didn't have any live footage to cover, and he asked a group of Vietnamese soldiers to get over by this little rice paddy dike or whatever it was, and to start firing into this tree line so he could get some live coverage of South Vietnamese soldiers firing at the enemy into this tree line. Well, the battle was ended, and but so the media, when they couldn't get the story they wanted, they would sometimes create their own story.
I think as far as the media actually knowing what was going on, I have my doubts. There were a lot of things that I was at or around which were considered big deals. And I probably met 6 or 7 reporters at different times during my 11 months with 19. And most of the time they seemed to come after the action was over, and they would kind of buzz around for a half hour, an hour, and then they'd be gone. Unless they were out with the troops, I don't think all the time, I don't think they could have given an accurate, evaluation. And I think a lot of them tried, but most of them, I think, were happy to go home at night and sleep in a regular bed and get something cold to drink and regular food.
The war was lost because of the press, the coverage of the press that was so slanted toward all the tragedy and the heart. War is not pretty. It's never been pretty.
The only thing I found a little bit disconcerting was some of the reporters and some of the photographers. They tried to hype their own role over there, and I thought that was certainly disingenuous of them to presume that their role was superior to some other's role. Because they were chroniclers of these events that made them experts or active participants. I faulted that.
When I came back from Vietnam, I started feeling, as I watched video or the TV, that the American people, public, myself included, we were vicariously participating in a war we had no business watching.
In regard to media coverage in South Vietnam, I have a real good parallel. It happened in a famous battle, I think it was the invasion of Italy, when Eisenhower, Commander-in-Chief of forces, Europe, got together all the media, and he said, in the morning we're making an invasion. This is how we're going to do it. Now, if any of you tell, you will be costing American lives. There was not one word breathed of that. That, to me, was patriotism. That's important. Can you imagine in Vietnam telling the news media anything that's sensitive, or telling them, don't you report this?
That's something that people need to know, because this is the spirit that Americans have. They don't know quit. They don't know fight a little, hide a little. They know to take the battle to the enemy to win. It's not to take little bits and drop back. It's but you attack, you attack, you attack, and you crush your enemy. And the unfortunate thing about the Vietnam War, the superlative job that Marines and soldiers and sailors and airmen did in trying to conduct that war has all been for naught, because somebody in the media somewhere didn't think it was America's job to do that, and they were wrong, very, very wrong about it.
We turn our attention next to 3 areas about which these officers of Marines chose to comment: the tactics we employed, the famous siege of Sanh, and observations about the Vietnamese people.
Way was more of a conventional type war, more like the World War II thing. We could actually use supporting arms, naval gunfire, even airstrikes, and tanks, from which was unique to most of the Vietnamese campaign. One thing, early in Tet, we were not winning the war. We were fighting to reestablish, to gain. I began to see a very distinct switch and change. They took over the city. We were trying to get it back. That was a little different than most of the campaigns in the Vietnamese War. But sometime into March, I saw a distinct change. They weren't standing and fighting. They were going back to their old tactics of hit and run. But Tet was a real wake-up call. It was a psychological impact. Also, it was a very real military impact. I think it woke up a few people to look. These guys really can fight. And that was my first experience with the North Vietnamese regulars. Anyone that ever faced the North Vietnamese regular army, hats off. They are a professional army, real good. I have no difficulty in appraising the high quality of the North Vietnamese regular units.
Yeah, the troops that I served with, a lot of them had been in country for some months, over 6 months, some of them, and they had been up north, and they had experienced a lot of different combat operations up north. And it was different up there. When they came down south, it was a little different type of warfare. Up north, they had been confronted with North Vietnamese artillery out of the demilitarized zone and heavy use of 82mm mortars and large organized units of NVA. And down in the Da Nang area, they didn't face that. It was booby traps, snipers, you were mixed in with civilians, you had to use different rules of engagement. And for some kids, some of the troops, it was a little uncomfortable, and it was disconcerting to have to play by a different set of rules.
It's like World War II, you go to win. And if we had the air power, we had the artillery, we had the naval gunfire, we had the troops on the ground that were capable of going, taking the ground, holding it, and moving from north. And we could have kicked butt. But every time we'd get some area, pull back, we're going to give that back to the Vietnamese, we're not going to advance here, that's a no-fire zone, this is a no-fire zone. That's bullshit. And those shots were being called not by the field commanders, obviously, but by politicians in D.C.
Sanh had a kind of a distinctive red dirt that kind of a fine sand that anything that going by stirred up dust. So there was the helicopter stirred up dust, the truck stirred up dust, the wind stirred up dust. So everything was covered with this kind of red dirt. And we formed up on the road to go out to the quarry, which is a mile and a half outside the base. And it was, here again, it was like a World War II movie. we were on the outside of the road starting to move west, and refugees were coming down the middle of the road going east. And here again, you got the crying and the chickens and the sewing machines, and you know, they were going to get on the choppers that we were getting off. And we went out and we set up around the quarry, and we were there for the next 90 days. And you know, most of the time you dug yourself a good bunker. You tried to stay in it or close to it. They wouldn't go out during the day to go to the washroom or anything. I mean, you know, they just kind of grin and bear it. And that's where the caisson shuffle kind of developed, where you kind of listened all the time, and you watched and you walked, and anytime you walked, you were ready to make a dive for a hole somewhere.
I guess one of the major things that struck me, because I'd heard so much about caisson, was the location of it itself, being down in a valley with high mountains to the north and to the west, and then 689 we were to the southwest. It just kind of struck me as a funny place to have a combat base being overlooked by all these high hills. But then we patrolled around that area for the next couple months, even after all the 26 Marines were withdrawn, and we patrolled up in Hill 881 South and 881 North and back to 689, and stayed in that area for until I was transferred in August. They sent my platoon because we were being mortared, and when we spotted that position, we figured that was the FO, forward observer. So they sent my platoon out to try to secure that hill and take out the position. And we had to go all the way down, you know, being on 689, you went all the way down to sea level and then back up this other hill. And it must have taken us several hours. And when we got to the crest of the hill, another thing that I'll always remember is when we saw the bunker, and there were 3 NVA troops, and when they took turns coming out of the bunker and throwing grenades and firing at us, they were dressed in brand new utilities. And we were ragamuffins. I mean, our clothes were rotting off of us and torn, and that's one thing that I always remember that came to mind was, here these, and I had a lot of respect for the enemy, here these fellows are, hundreds of miles from home, 3 of them in a bunker, taking on a platoon of Marines, good-looking uniforms.
I thought we belonged there, if for no other reason than the protection and care of the people that were there. I thought we owed them a duty based on earlier commitments that we had made to the civilian populace. And I think that we were there to protect and help them. And I still resent the fact that there are so many Americans who felt that we were there fighting the Vietnamese. We weren't fighting the Vietnamese, we were helping the Vietnamese. We were fighting the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And there's so many that feel we were fighting every Vietnamese in the country.
The commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, great man, General Orman R. Simpson, was an agricultural graduate. He realized the value, if they are 98% agrarian, that's where the biggest impact could be made. We introduced a hybrid rice, IR8 rice, that resulted in a 66% increased yield in the first planting. Wow. We imported purebred swine from the American Midwest for crossbreeding, and it resulted in an almost 50% larger animal at the first cross. We introduced anthelmintics, which is parasites were horrible over there, internal parasites and worms, and I got that into the people. We had a cabbage developed in the Manila Islands. It was called Chinese cabbage. Greatly increased the production of vegetables. And to me, this was very, very rewarding. I almost extended to continue to pursue that, but even today, it helped resolve my feelings toward the people. The Vietnamese people were really good people. They were caught in a very difficult situation, but in a small part, very, very proud of what I'd done to introduce Western ways in their agriculture, the swine, and since so many of them are involved in rice production, a 66% increase was fantastic, and it worked.
A lot of people are under the impression that the Vietnamese did not give enough themselves. I was in a few villages where there were no men. No men. From 14 to 50, there were no men. They gave a great deal, and I think that we didn't respect that. We didn't show the understanding of that we should have.
The resounding criticism voiced by professional warriors in the Vietnam War was the mire created by the rules and indecision of American political leaders. Few, if any, fighting men have kind words for those who asserted their power to tie the collective hands of the American war machine, thereby rendering it a virtual punching bag. Most cite the success of America and her allies in the Gulf War. Once committed to the task, the forces were assembled, the battle plan finalized, objectives identified and executed. The military was given its orders and carried them out with little or no political interference. When discussions into the causes of our lack of success in Vietnam take place, all attention swings to Washington.
We did go to Vietnam, and we, being the participants, our intentions were honorable, and in the fact that we were there to preserve a way of life and democracy for the South Vietnamese people. The intentions were misguided, and for the reason being that the leaders of our country and the politicians in charge of the war did not allow the war to be won. They caved in to the demonstrators and hamstrung the troops who fought the war.
The biggest deficiency that we had in Southeast Asia. We fought a war with one hand tied behind us, without a defined enemy, without a defined objective.
I think the most important thing for America is that when it is decided by our leadership that the U.S. military should be involved in any military operation, there should be a definite mission or goal. There should be a time set, and once it is decided to use our military, the operations should be conducted solely by military leaders.
First of all, the war wasn't lost. Militarily, we won the war, there's no question about that. A lot of people don't know that, or they won't say that, but we didn't lose the war militarily. We lost the war politically. There's no question that militarily that we outperformed the NVA, etc. But we lost politically, obviously in the Tet Offensive, the aftermath, even though I think militarily we won that. But you know, the war wasn't, it just wasn't, didn't win the hearts and minds of the people at home.
We had some tough go-arounds with the North Vietnamese. We had some tough fights, but I don't think anybody would say that we lost any of those battles. The battle was lost in Washington, you might say, before the battle began. Their decisions, which have been chronicled now, even good old Bob McNamara spilled his guts here recently, and in an apparent attempt at apology, and chronicled his own role in the decision-making process. It was clearly a situation where they didn't have the will or the stomach to conduct it in any different fashion. So the war was lost before I even got there.
Politicians should not be conducting a war. If they want to commit the troops, that's their decision. But once the troops are there, I think the military ought to be running the war, not the politicians.
I completely supported our standing by our end of the CETO agreement and supporting the South Vietnamese regime, regardless of their corruption. It's international politics. What I took extreme offense to later on was when I learned about the manipulation by the McNamara's, et cetera, back in Washington, and the limitation of our capabilities.
Look at history, and you look at civilizations, and you look at some great ones, the Greeks and the Romans. They all had their pinnacle. And what I am really, really worried about is that Vietnam would be our pinnacle. And because of what happened, and because we didn't hold our heads up high, and because we didn't go in with the will to win, and the will to win extremely fast with the minimum loss of life, that historians in 100 or 200 years from now will say that America, that was your, World War II was your finest hour, and it was lost in a 10-year war because of what politicians were not willing to win.
Our intentions were honorable and pure in the fact that it was to give the South Vietnamese people a choice in their way of life and government. Unfortunately, the people who were running the war, and these are the best and the brightest, to quote from a book by David Halberstam, the best and the brightest were not necessarily the best and the brightest, and the fact that they were bureaucrats, Robert McNamara being one of them. I believe he was the Secretary of Defense during the war, and the sitting president in the White House, Lyndon Johnson, who took it as a personal affront that he, being a Texan, that some pissant little country could push a Texan around, and McNamara, who thought the war could be fought through MBA skills and accounting skills that he learned at Ford Motor Company and in dealing with mass production and vehicles. So the leaders were certainly too many of the leaders of the war were misinformed as to what we were up against, the history of why the communist side was so committed.
And I think history will reveal that politicians need to have more defined objectives, which I think everyone agree we did not have.
I think the country as a whole let down its troops that went over there, and I think it was just a bad time in American history. Hopefully we'll never have to go through that again, but I think when a country doesn't support, obviously you're not going to always be able to support the political situation, that's why we have a democracy, but once that decision is made and you have the type of civil unrest that we had in particularly in 68 and 67, 69, and just outright insurrection at home on college campuses, etc., and calling the people, those of us that went to Vietnam, you know, killers and baby killers, etc. I mean, I think that's a travesty.
One of the most maddening after effects of the combat experience is the brush of failure with which everyone paints the Vietnam vet. The plain truth about the war is that U.S. forces were victorious in all major battles, even the 1968 Tet Offensive. In every Marine officer is reposed, quote, special trust and confidence, end quote. A mantle of responsibility to be vigilant and to execute all duties and orders in a professional manner. The special trust is especially poignant in the relationship a new lieutenant develops with his men. With men, there can be no stronger bond than that born on the field of battle. When the conversation changes to their troops, there is a tangible shift in mood as these former lieutenants beam about their troops. A special sense of paternity stirs as each one speaks of those who wore the title Marine, and materializes only from the love and devotion forged by sweat, blood, and the stark terror of combat arms.
I want to take this opportunity to discuss not what I did or didn't do in Vietnam, but to talk about the enlisted Marines that were in my platoon. I served in the northern I Corps area, pretty much the trace of the DMZ, and with respect to the enlisted personnel, the snuffies, with all due respect to that term, they were, in a word, magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. There's some characteristics which I'd like to share. Certainly dedication to fulfilling the mission. They were, although young, very dedicated to getting the job done. They were determined, absolutely determined, to follow the orders of their fire team leader, their squad leader, their platoon sergeant, or myself, the platoon commander. They were aggressive, so aggressive in fact that sometimes I had to hold them back when they were about to do something that was foolhardy that might cost them their lives or unnecessarily endanger the lives of other members of the platoon. They were a very disciplined group of young men, and one of the main reasons I'm sharing this experience today is that I wanted everyone to know that there was no harassing of civilians, there was no burning down of hutches, there was no abuse of prisoners, and they conducted themselves in the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps, as well as the highest traditions of being a human being.
I knew from my enlisted days that the enlisted people know what the hell's going on, and they'd been there a lot longer than I had. And I let them know right up front. I said, look, I may be your boss and title, but I think you guys know that you know the ropes. And as long as we remember that I am in charge and I'm responsible, that you are here to keep me alive, and I'm here to keep you alive as best we can. We'll work that together.
I think the biggest thing that America should know about the Vietnam War is that the American military deported themselves in a professional and credible manner. American forces conducted combat operations against a determined foe and won every major battle, including the Tet Offensive. The only city that they took was Hue City, and they had that, I believe, for 3 weeks. And that was taken back by Marines, house to house, street to street, and in some cases hand to hand. And at the end, to be politically correct, the South Vietnamese forces were given to look as if they had executed that battle, where in fact American forces has done it.
They all perform their duties like a Marine should, with minimal complaint, under difficult circumstances.
Excellent squad leaders. I had some guys who knew the job and knew the role. They were real corporals in the strict sense of the term. A corporal was somebody who took care of his squad, who looked out for their welfare, who interpreted the orders of the lieutenant, and he had his skills honed to a fine edge. They were good land navigators. They knew how to read a compass. They knew how to read the terrain. They knew their weapons, and they knew knew the enemy. They knew how to move, and I felt extremely fortunate to have these young guys who knew their job as part of my platoon, and they made my job a lot easier. And how old were they? They were probably 19 at the most. I think I had one kid who was 20. So they were just kids, but they were Marines, well-trained and experienced, and they knew how to make the most of the situation.
I tell you, from what I remember, they were all young kids, probably 18, 19 years old, very professional, very on top of their job, And as far as I could tell, they expected me to know my job. And I liked those troops, everyone, even, the staff, senior enlisted, but especially the younger troops. They seemed to go about their job in a professional manner, and I was impressed.
As you remember, one of the things they always told us was when you first get over there, that platoon commander, if he's an E6 or whatever he is, he's been there, he's probably been there twice, and you better learn from him and learn quick because he may be gone.
The old Corps isn't dead. They would physically impose discipline upon them if they were goofing off and endangering their own lives.
I have seen many Marines wounded or even worse, lay down their life to pull in their wounded comrade. So performance, day after day, long patrols, very rigorous. I am happy to report the way they performed.
I saw a little bit of everything, to the extreme bravery of a corpsman trying to save the life of a Marine when he was sitting or astride this Marine trying to do heart resuscitation, and I'm watching him from being as close to the ground as I possibly could because there was incoming fire, and marveling at this corpsman who was out there exposing himself, trying to save the life of another Marine.
These kids would, these young Marines, they'd do anything you ask. They'd die for you.
It's okay. I feel the same way.
Sorry.
It's all right. Vietnam veterans are not some weird breed of American. We are American. The fighting men that served did their duty. They did their duty in an honorable way. They made a quality decision to serve their country. They didn't burn their draft cards. They didn't go to Canada. They didn't protest. They answered the call of America.
Certainly the highlight of my life to be called their leader. And it's something that I value to this day and always will.
I am concerned that because we didn't want to win, that if we get into trouble like we got into in World War II, that do we have the moral fiber in this country to stand up and do what really needs to be done and forget about all of the political excuses, but let's just go do our job and get this country back online. And let's honor those men.
I think that our troops that were there weren't given the proper understanding and respect for what they did. I think we should have treated it as a war. We should have been proud of what went on. We should have supported people and made people happy that they came home and proud of what they did, and made it something they could talk about within limits, proudly, not only amongst themselves. I think that was probably the biggest problem that came out from the civilian population. And I think even the fact that 31 years later, myself and maybe everyone you've talked to refers the civilian population as if they're still not a part of it.
I kind of have a difficult time with losing something when you won every battle, and you lost because you have a liberal news media that said they lost the war. The Tet Offensive, for example, there was a military victory, and yet they call it the turning point of the war, which basically I guess it probably was. But can you imagine a a sports team that won, and they go home and then on the news the next day being told that they lost? Who in America would believe that? And yet that's exactly what we had to endure, and we've endured it for 30 years, and it's been painful.
We paid a terrible price. We're continuing to pay a terrible price in 1998 because we've taught people that you don't always, first of all, I think, like our speaker said last night, we don't trust the government. People that went to Vietnam don't trust the government, and the people that didn't go to Vietnam don't trust the government. I think the people that went to Vietnam in many cases are bitter because the government didn't back them up. The people that didn't go to Vietnam have instilled a kind of civil disobedience in their minds and in their children's minds. I'm a school teacher, and we now have kids raising kids because the parents learn that you don't have to play by the rules. There's no penalty if you don't play by the rules, and the parents don't have rules for their kids, and you have 11-year-olds shooting people and everything else. I think we've paid a much higher price than we initially thought we were going to pay. The 53,000 that died in Vietnam were just kind of a down payment on what it has done to our society. If we go into something like that, you better be prepared to finish it. You just can't have somebody saying, okay, we'll help you, unless you know the true cost of the help. That would be the message. Liberty is not free.
I would say that something simple that was on just about every lighter you bought in Vietnam. Freedom has the taste the protected will never know.
Now, as the famous commentator Paul Harvey says, you've heard the rest of the story. Vietnam is not the black mark it has been portrayed to be. Vietnam veterans and family members of Vietnam veterans, take heart. Marines, sailors, soldiers, and airmen served in Vietnam with honor and distinction. Jesus said, "No greater love has any man than he lay down his life for his friends." This is the essence of the Vietnam experience. Americans shed their blood that another people might live free from the tyranny of communism. America has yet to see its finest hour. Yet it is contingent upon us to assure that the warriors of the United States are never put in harm's way needlessly again. Freedom does have the taste the protected will never know. Sacrifice has been made for the freedom we enjoy. These sacrifices have been made by patriots throughout America's history. Patriots who have always risen in times of crisis. To the patriots who served in Vietnam, who fought, who bled and died, we salute you. Semper Fi.